Okay, so we had three discussion topics on the table for our breakout rooms. One, what was the thesis and your analysis of the reading? Two, what were some of the causes of this great migration? And then finally, what interests you most in the reading and what questions did you have about the reading? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout room? Kevin?
Is it right if I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin. Then we'll go to Joanna.
Oh, okay, so one of the things I found interesting in the readings was the section when it was talking about the some of the leaders such as Ida B. Wells, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Mhm.
And the most fascinating thing for me while reading this was how they all had a very common or similar goal, but Du Bois and Washington, their ways of getting there was very contradicting. Like they even stated themselves that the whole, I don't know how to say it, but like their way of reaching it to bettering Africans was completely different. Like Washington, he believed in order to better your standing was through essentially kind of just adjusting and like just working, while Du Bois, he believed in education, that you shouldn't just like kind of lower yourself for others. That's why I got from it.
Yeah, that's a very good call out, Kevin. Just kind of paraphrase what Kevin's articulating, right? They talk about these central figures in the epic of African history. And then what Kevin is attentive to is why they all had the same type of goals, right? They all had the same aims. Their methods of going about those goals and those aims differed, right? And one of the central arguments of the time, especially when you're thinking about Du Bois, you're thinking about the likes of Booker T. Washington, was this question of how do African people advance their social conditions, right? And as Kevin articulates, um, Booker T. Washington was under the guise of pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? We're going to work to increase our social capabilities, right? Whereas Du Bois would argue that it was education that was going to be the mechanism that's going to allow African peoples to achieve social advancement. Now, if we are to kind of focus the conversation on education, there's also a bifurcation within educational models as it pertains to what's the best way of going about African education, right? The likes of Booker T. Washington would establish what's called the Hampton and Tuskegee Institute, right, which is going to be about teaching you how to work in the field, right, teaching you how to deal with agricultural means and things like that, because at the time that was the economic foundation of the country, right? So in Washington's thinking, let's prepare the community to be workers within the society, right? And he felt like this was a more attainable step because this is a society who is comfortable with African people engaging in labor that's free, right? So it's a natural progression for them to go from a free labor source to a minimal paid labor source, and the company and the country would be more willing to acquiesce to that, right? To whereas Du Bois is under the auspice of no, we should receive an education that allows us to have access to all the disciplines that normal people get, right? And from there, we'll be able to establish a intellectual upper class that will go out and be able to educate all of the masses of African people. This is this idea that Du Bois has of the talented 10th, right? And it may not go into this far of a detail in the readings, but just kind of provide you some extra contextualizations to these central figures. And also this bifurcation that Kevin is talking about, and when I say bifurcation, it's just being split in two different ways, right? So this bifurcation, this continues on into the 60s and the Black Power era, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Who else would like to share what was discussed in the breakout rooms? Joanna, you were going to say something, correct?
Well, Yeah, I think he pretty much said it. But, so what we discussed in our group was the thesis and the analysis. So in my opinion, the civil rights movement and what it did was to politically educate Black people, and versus a Black Power movement, which was more of a sense of pride. And I don't remember if it was Malcolm X who said that you have to do it at all costs, meaning that they use, in a sense of, unlike the civil rights movement, that everything was in a peaceful manner, like the sit-ins, the marches, I feel that the Black Power movement was not extremes in a sense, but I mean, if you have to fight back, you have to fight back, to defend yourself. So, and I went a little bit into the what was the Watts revolt. I did that reading on my own, and I found it very interesting what happened there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's what I got.
And then you're right. It is Malcolm X, and the quote is "by any means necessary." Right. So we're going to achieve our freedom. We're going to achieve our liberation. We're going to achieve empowerment by any means necessary. So nothing is off the table in our attempts to achieve these things. And you're right. The Watts Rebellion, it sets the precedent for a lot of the what they call the so there was a string of rebellions that would take place in the middle to late 60s. And in fact, if you are familiar with the work of Malcolm X, he has a speech entitled The Ballot or the Bullet. And in this speech, he literally predicts this epic of rebellions that would go on through all the major cities. So not only was it Watts, it was New York, it was Chicago, it was Detroit, all the major cities in the United States in this year, 1968, I believe, 1965 through 68, it was a string of these mass rebellions, right? And what Joanna is pointing us to, right, is the continuation of this bifurcation that Kevin mentioned, where certain segments of the population are saying that we must do this nonviolently, right? We must do this the civil rights way. And there's other segments of the population saying, like, fuck, to hell with all that, right? We're going to do whatever we can, whatever we need to do to get ourselves free, right? So this is the continuation of that bifurcation. Let's get one more, and then we'll move into my notes. I would like to hear one more about what was discussed in your breakout rooms. Anybody have any questions about the reading?
One question that I wrote in the journal is why do police use violence against peaceful Black protesters and activists, like especially in like the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement?
Yeah, and I think Gabriel also what's dope about your question. Not only is it a poignant question, right? It also applies to what's going on in the world today, because you see the same tactics being employed to squash out protests that were being done in the '60s that are taking place now, right? So I think that's a very good question, and one could argue, right? It will all come back down to power, right? And we're going to use these violent tactics to show that we are the authority, that we are the power, and we have the ability to squash out all the attempts that you may make to empower yourself. Another way to think about this, or another way to answer Gabriel's question, is the idea of a spectacle lynching. Has anybody heard of this term? You should be familiar with the term lynching from the reading, but this term spectacle lynching, has anybody heard of this before?
Spectacle?
Spectacle lynching.
No, I don't think I've heard.
Nicole, were you going to say something?
No, I haven't heard of spectacle lynching.
I see you nodding your head, Lorianne. Are you familiar with it, or kinda? Could you share a little bit?
I think not. I was thinking spectacle like glasses. Never mind.
But kinda, you're not far off, right? So essentially, what the spectacle lynching is to put this lynching on public display, right? And when they would have these lynchings, they would be like in the middle of town square or something of that nature, to where everyone would come out, and it would quite literally be a social event. It would be a social gathering, right? Where you would bring food, you would take pictures, you would get souvenirs from these events, right? And it's also situated as a passing down of tradition. For those who want to do some extra reading, there's a really brief short story by James Baldwin titled "Going to Meet the Man." And he talks about the spectacle lynching and how it becomes a type of pathology for white entitlement and white empowerment, right? And another thing with the spectacle lynching is the real intention behind this is we're going to take this individual, right? And if we are to take, and we could think about this in the context of the plantation society, okay? Typically what happens is the most rebellious, the biggest, baddest, boldest African on the plantation will be the first one to jump bad and try to defy the rules of the plantation, right? And what happens is he'll be brought into whoever will be brought into a public sphere and beat viciously in front of everyone so that everyone else will see, if you try to go outside of the parameters of this plantation society, this will be your fate, right? So it's to show to everyone else, if you step out of line, right? If you become off the chain, then this is going to be your ultimate reality, right? And that continues through the area of Jim Crow, that continues through the civil rights era, right? And there's been lynchings as recently as 2 years ago, right? So these lynchings still continue. And when I say souvenirs, this is not hyperbole. This is quite literal, right? They'll cut off pieces of the hand. They'll cut off feet. They'll cut off limbs. They'll cut off the genitalia, right? And they would take it home and have them as souvenirs. In fact, in a lot of, I've seen a documentary that talks about homes in the deep South that are sold. And as they go through the basements of the home and they try to clear the home out so it could be sold, they're finding the leftover remnants of body parts of people who were the victims of these so-called lynchings, right? Even the term picnic, we're all familiar with, right? A very non-political, a very harmonious and upful term, right? It derives from the etymology of picnic is literally to pick a nigga and hang him. That's exactly what this term picnic stems from, right? So this idea of spectacle lynching is so ingrained in American society that we don't even know terms like picnic, where they stem from, right? Okay, before I jump into my notes, is there any questions, comments, or concerns? All right, so we'll get into the section.
Please,
Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Negritude is a literary and political current created by Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Gontran Damas. The negritude was nourished like the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And the Black Power movement by the ideas of Marcus Garvey, Webb Du Bois, and the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes.
Why did Maluna Karenga, when discussing the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, did not allude to negritude?
Yeah. Thank you, Baba Pierre. That's a very brilliant question. So let me kind of provide context for the rest of the class, right? So what Baba Pierre is pointing us to is this negritude movement that happens really around the same time. Well, I would say the 40s, 50s, 60s kind of births this negritude movement, right? And it's thinkers like Aimé Césaire from the island of Martinique. Senghor is a continental African. I forget what country he's from. But there's these thinkers. I'm sorry, go ahead. Senegal. Thank you, Baba Pierre. He's from Senegal, right? So it's these thinkers who, just like in the United States, we have Black Power, and they're saying that, you know what? I'm no longer going to look at my Blackness as a deficit, right? I'm going to take this blackness and use it as a source of power and a source of pride. This is also going on in what they call francophone countries, right? French-speaking countries. So Martinique is an island that is a French colony. Senegal at the time was a French colony as well, right? So these thinkers, these producers, these writers, these intellects are getting together and they're reclaiming their blackness through this negritude movement, right? And this is done through poetry. This is done through writing. And a lot of this is inspired by what's going on here in the States, right? They're attentive to the Black Power movement. They're attentive to the civil rights movement, right? And they're taking this thrust and they're actualizing it in a francophone type of aesthetic, right? So Baba Pierre's question is, why didn't Karenga place the proper emphasis and the appropriate, focus on this negritude movement? And you're right, and I can't speak to why he left that out, but I don't believe you could talk about Black power being a global idea and leave out the negritude movement, because it is the negritude movement becomes a vehicle that allows this notion to become global, right? And really, it becomes a central component to this idea and this notion of Pan-Africanism. In fact, if you want to kind of dive deeper, give me 1 second, y'all. Hold on, what's up? Huh? Why? What happened? I'm sorry, give me 1 second, y'all. What happened? Go get a napkin. What did you do? It's not that bad, bro. You all right? Go get a napkin like that. I'll get you a bedding when you're done. All right, so if you want to dive deeper into this idea of negritude, this is a book entitled Afrikaner Critical Theory. Not only does it central this notion of negritude, but it provides you a theoretical framework to kind of just engage ideas around Africa. It has a chapter, 1 second, he talks about how the negritude movement was inspired by the Harlem Renaissance, and he's looking at Amy Césaire, Leopold Senghar. The title of the chapter is called Amy Césaire, Leopold Senghar, and Revolutionary Negritude and Radical New Negroes, right? So he's really putting together this idea of the Harlem Renaissance as being inspired by that negritude movement. So that's just some other readings if you guys want to go a little bit deeper into that. But Bobby Pierre, that's a really good call out. Really good call out. And I think also, right, this is the benefit of having not just Africans in America in these spaces, right? Baba Pierre is able to bring a continental African perspective, which is going to center and actualize the negritude movement. So that's a really good insight. Excuse me. Okay. So for my notes, and this is pulling from the reading, of course, and it talks about how initially the migration was going south, right? Africans were migrating further to spaces in the southern hemisphere of the United States, but then something shifts and they begin to migrate north. And then in the words of Du Bois, he says, the tide, by the 1900s, the tide was turning in favor of northern cities, right? The most significant change among the blacks in the last 10 or 20 years had been the influx into northern cities. And again, that's from the words of Du Bois. Some of the causes for these migrations, to escape racial oppression, of course, right? It's this old idea, this old misnotion that racism is a Southern phenomenon, right? But the book articulates how even in the North, they experience racism. But again, to escape racism was one of the primary reasons for their transition up north. Two, a depressed economic situation in the South, right? The failure of the crops and things of that nature caused them to look to the northern cities to help find work. Three, the growth of the industrial revolution in the North also caused for people to migrate north looking for other jobs. And then World War I cut off the migration of European migrants into the Americas, and that was the workforce for a lot of these industries. And since that workforce was left void, African Americans sought to move up into these cities to fill that working void. Real briefly, it talks about Ida B. Wells and her work in the anti-lynching movement. And for me, this is where this becomes fundamentally important, right? And I think about this as it pertains to relations between Black men and Black women, right? And you could take it all the way back here. there's no one been more supportive and more 10 toes down for black men than black women, right? This is an anti-lynching movement established by a black woman for a phenomenon that largely impacts black men, right? By and large, disproportionately, black men were being lynched more than black women. With this being a reality, right, Ida B. Wells did not have to take up the charge and say that, yo, we need to magnify this phenomenon going on within the country. She could have just kept to her own, because her as a woman, the chances of her being lynched are a lot slimmer. But no, she understood that her well-being was tied to the well-being of the black man, and she went on a whole crusade to ensure that black men's bodies are maintained and they're safe, right? So for me, anytime that you start to hear conversations that are divisive between black men and black women, I always return to the work of Ida B. Wells, right? Because this shows you that there's been no better support system for black men than black women, and I would argue vice versa. This idea of a modal period, and Karenga provides us with a definition of this notion of a modal period. And he says a modal period is a period which defined black life in a profound and enduring way, in sense, right? So again, this becomes important when you think about the mission of Black Studies, right? The mission of Black Studies is to focus on the agency of blackness, right? The actual happenings of blackness. This notion of a modal period becomes foundational in the way of understanding this aspect of African agency. It kind of shifts from the. I'm kind of going to go through what I will do though, because we didn't talk about Garvey. If you look above me, right, you see like a little underneath my chest. There's a red, black, and green. It's a flag, right? That is the Pan-African flag. The red symbolizes the blood of African people. The black represents the people themselves, and then the green represents the land, right? This is contrived from the brainchild of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was the author or the contributor or the foremost thinker and the developer of the organization of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which in the 1920s, during the time of the Harlem Renaissance, was the largest widespread global movement of African people that there was, right? Garvey is a Jamaican who migrates to the United States and ends up in Harlem, and he creates this very broad, mass-based movement that really talks about African pride, talks about African economics, it talks about African agency, right? Tidbit of information, Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, was a member of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and a lot of the black nationalism that Malcolm X was exposed to as a child stemmed directly from his father's contact and work with Marcus Garvey, right? So another thing to talk about this bifurcation, right? These two lines of thoughts when you think about the way that African people are trying to advocate for their freedom. Marcus Garvey symbolizes another chain of thought, right? Marcus Garvey, some would argue, is like the intellectual head of the Black Power movement, right? So from him, you would get the likes of Malcolm, you would get the likes of Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, you would get the likes of the members of the Black Panther Party, right? So he represents another central figure of this idea of Black power. So as we move to kind of getting more recent, right? And he focuses on this area or this epic of the 60s. And he says that the 60s were a fundamental area. He says, thus, the reaffirmation of the 60s stands unquestionably as one of the most definitive and significant decades in the history of Black people in the United States. Indeed, it is the decade that the major civil rights and nationalist organizations and personalities reached their height and have not regained a similar status since then. This is also the decade in which African Americans made the most severe and successful theoretical and practical criticisms of the structure and content of the United States society. And it is the decade that ordinary people did and achieved extraordinary things in the interest of freedom and justice, right? Going on to the next page. It says, thus, in 1963, most definitely, in the period of 1965 through 1968, the strategy of nonviolence was challenged by the urban revolts, and in 1966, SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led the move from integrated groups and aspirations to Black groups and Black power. It was also in the middle of the 60s that the Back to Black thrust expanded to reach beyond the United States. Again, think negritude, right? Beyond the United States. Where'd I go? Beyond the United States to Africa for models and inspirations. Thus, though we speak of the 60s as a unified process on hand and is instructive on the other hand, excuse me, let me read that again. Thus, though we speak of the 60s as a unified process on the one hand, right, it is instructive on the other hand to recognize the two basic tendencies which shaped and informed this critical decade, right? So again, Karenga is pointing us to this bifurcation. So yes, you could think about the 60s being a unified front of nonviolent struggle and civil rights movement, but Karenga is saying, nah, if you look closely, you can see that even this bifurcation is present in the 60s. And a lot of this bifurcation is centered around this question of nonviolence. Okay, so SNCC, right, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you know about me, my two favorite ancestors are Malcolm X and Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was an organizer with SNCC. Born in Trinidad, his parents migrate to New York, Bronx. He attends Bronx Science High School. From Bronx Science High School, he goes to Howard University, where he's majoring in philosophy. And while doing his undergrad work at Howard, he gets involved in the civil rights struggle. He goes from NAG, which is an organization on the campus of Howard, and eventually joins CORE, and then, was it CORE? Yeah, it was CORE and then SNCC, okay? So what becomes very important about Kwame Ture, right? She could literally be viewed as the link between civil rights to Black power, okay? One of the things that they do through SNCC is they organize in Loudon County, Mississippi, right? In Loudon County, Mississippi, and this is the autobiography of Kwame Ture. It's titled Ready for Revolution. Really good book. It's long, like 700 pages, but it's a really good book. Anyway, so they go down to Mississippi and they're organizing in Mississippi around voter registration, right? This should sound familiar to y'all in your current moment, right? Loudon, Mississippi is one of the most racist, but also one of the most blackest areas in Mississippi, right? And the idea is, if we are to politically educate the citizens of Mississippi, form a party, right, a political party, and then we could put people on the ballot, right? And we could get Black folks into political office. So they do this, and they fund the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, I believe it's called. So as you may know, when you have a party, the Democratic Party's their symbol, I believe, one of them is an elephant, and then the Republicans, I forget what their symbol is, but like they have these symbols, right? So just like the Democrats and Republicans have the symbol, SNCC says, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, they must have a symbol also. They come up with a panther. The reason being is the nature of a panther is it doesn't mess with anybody. It won't bother nobody until it's fucked with, right? But once it gets fucked with, it's on your ass. And they attributed that characteristic to the people of Mississippi, right? They're going to be law-abiding citizens. They're going to mind their business. They won't bother nobody. But once they begin to get messed with, they're going to respond in force, right? So the Black Panther becomes the symbol for the Freedom Democratic Party, okay? Now, here's another thing to think about or to consider when talking about the organization efforts in Mississippi. They were doing the voter registration campaigns, but they realize they cannot successfully do these voter registration campaigns without politically educating the citizens of Mississippi, so they can know why they're voting. They can know the power that they have behind their vote, right? So what they did is they established freedom schools, and they set up these little tents. One second, what's up? Okay, y'all chill. Let me get going with class, okay? Yeah, just until I'm done. Yeah. Sorry, y'all. So you just PBS kids, come on, I'm in class. So they established these voter registrations through these freedom schools, right? And what would happen is, remember the very, not only is it one of the blackest spaces in Mississippi, it's also one of the most racist spaces in Mississippi. And the sheriff of that town is very, very racist. So what he would do is they would ride by the freedom schools, and they would call them, they also call like tent cities, because there would be a bunch of tents set up that would serve as schools. And they would shoot into the tents. They would throw bombs into the tents, right? So they'll be fighting these very vicious acts of violence, the members of SNCC were. So what's happening is, I don't, have anybody heard of the Deacons of Defense? Does that term sound familiar to anyone? Okay. So what's happening as they're trying to starve off these onslaughts of violence, these people from New Orleans, who are related to H. Rap Brown, who's mentioned in the text, call themselves the Deacons of Defense. And these are armed militia groups that come to defend the Freedom Campus and the organizing efforts of the people in SNCC, right? So what happens is, when the likes of the Ku Klux Klan, the sheriff comes and tries to ride on these freedom towns, the Deacons of Defense are organized in a way that they shoot back, right? And they're able to kind of prevent these violent acts from happening. Kwame gets the idea, why don't we go to these other major cities, organize the urban areas, people who you may call gang members, right? Why don't we organize them, bring them down to Mississippi, and allow them to serve as a protection force for the organizers in SNCC, right? So this whole idea of the Deacons of Defense expands and becomes a national idea. So not only is it people from Mississippi and New Orleans, it becomes people from LA, it becomes people from Chicago, it becomes people from New York, it becomes people from Florida, right? It becomes a national thing. And this idea picks up steam, and black folks get a charge, if you will, right, from defending themselves, right? And this spirit, this energy evolves and eventually becomes the Black Panthers, Black Panther Party of Self-Defense that we know of, that stems out of Oakland. Because some of these people who join the Deacons of Self-Defense, they are from Oakland. Two of them being G.E.P. Newton and Bobby Seale, which eventually become the co-founders of the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense, right? So this is why I say that Kwame Ture, as one person, is centrally the link between this idea of the civil rights nonviolent movement to the Black Power movement. Okay. I'm gonna get into that. Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, they also at this time produced the text Black Power. What's important about this text, it shifts this notion of racism from being a individual actions, right? So this person did this racist thing to me. And they shift that to being a focus on an institutional racism, right? Structuralized racism, how this institution can be racist, how the court system can be a racist institution, how the school system can be in racist institutions, right? How institutions of religion can promote racism, right? And now in our modern era, they're starting to be more attentive to the fact that hospitals are institutions that promote racism, right? So this is one of the benefits of the text Black Power, is to shift the idea of racism being individualized to a more institutionalized idea. There was 4 basic tenets for the Black Power movement. There was a religious thrust, a cultural thrust, a political thrust, and an economic thrust. And then Kwaranga kind of shifts and talks about like the occurrences that take place after the 60s, right? And he goes into the 80s and the 90s. For me, I felt like that section pays too much attention to the opposing forces, right? It talks a lot about some of the things that prevented Black power from maintaining itself and manifesting. Respectability politics, right? The shift to a more everybody focusing on electoral politics opposed to community organizing and things of that nature. Trying to get Jesse Jackson elected, right? But then the 90s happens. In the 90s sees kind of a resurgence of consciousness, I'll say. But a lot of that stems from the occurrences of Rodney King, right? And the happenings that take place after that. The 92 LA rebellions that take place. And I think this also leads to a cultural nationalist production in the 90s. Just thinking about, I was born in 83, so I very much grew up in the 90s, right? The TV, the radio, the movies, there was like this Black renaissance that took place during this time where, I mean, think about it as a kid, right? Channel 11 on Thursday nights would be strictly Black programming, right? It would be like Martin, Living Single, and then this show called New York Undercover, right? And this is something that like a space that Black folks had to kind of tap into our own culture. And prior to that, it wasn't really done at that capacity. You had the like Blaxploitation films of the 70s. You had shows like Good Times and The Jeffersons. But that was slightly different, right? Because these are these shows in the 90s were Black folks telling Black stories, right? And to me, I attribute that to like the cultural revolution that took place. Okay, I'm gonna put my notes on pause there. We can move from there to our fishbowl. You could talk about my notes, you could talk about the breakout room conversations, or you could talk about your journals. All that's on the table. Remember, you have 2 fishbowls per semester and 1 time to pass. Does anybody want to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I'll volunteer.
I'm sorry, who said that? Daniel?
Yeah.
Okay, got you, Daniel. Anyone else? All right, so I'll call that random. Remember, you have 1 time to pass, 2 times per semester. Jessica, are you prepared to fishbowl?
I'm gonna pass this time.
All right. Brian, are you prepared to fishbowl?
Yeah, I could fishbowl.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We'll get 1 more. Kevin, are you prepared to fishbowl? Oh, Marcus, you raise your hand to volunteer?
Yes.
Okay, so I got Marcus. So we'll go with Daniel, Brian, and Marcus for our fishbowl today. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I was gonna say that I'm just gonna be talking about the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott sparked an activist, Rosa Parks. This was an important catalyst for the civil rights movement. This movement became a model for struggles for human liberation that inspired other struggles for freedom, justice in this country around the world. Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery for a white male passenger. The very next day, Martin Luther King proposed a citywide boycott against racial segregation on the public transportation system. And this led up to a chain of events for the Untitled movement. The movement protested segregation policies and I can't say the name. Belen and Durham campaign. The goal of it was to end discrimination in the economy, politicals, and the Alabama city against African American residents, and to the March of Washington to protest for jobs and freedoms for African Americans. And this special quote, or this famous iconic quote, "I have a dream." Martin Luther King said that right there. And the Bloody Sunday, many African Americans got beat up, even though it was a peaceful protest for housing, education, and employment and health. And this civil rights movement was a very essential, and it gave Black people their first major accomplishment.
Thank you. Dan. I got some notes on the civil rights movement and Rosa Parks, and I'll get to that at the end of the fishbowl. Who's next?
I'll go.
Okay.
So when you were talking about from your notes about Marcus Garvey, that he was really good at like doing all kinds of like good stuff about our country and the different like socialists. He talked about like how we can develop and grow from our culture and different civil rights movement. And then another thing that I want to add to that is that I think this was a question about why Marcus Garvey was doing all of this for us to like develop and have our good civil rights or education. Have our good education and good civil rights come to our life.
So the question, Marcus, is why did Marcus Garvey organize and advocate for Black folks to have their civil rights and education?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question, man. I would argue, I think that he was visionary, right? And he was ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. And he was one that didn't buy into the narratives of who Black people were. And because he didn't buy into those narratives, he saw in us what many of us did not see in ourselves. And he sought to bring out the best in us. And he sought to bring out what he saw that lay latent in us and bring that to the fore, right? And I just think that very visionary, very ahead of his time. And another way to think about it, I just think that the ancestors, right, those who came before him, they were moving in him in such a strong way that it gave him the capacity to have this vision and to be ahead of his time. So I just think he was tapped into a spiritual element that most of us aren't tapped into.
Okay.
Very good question. Brian, you're next one.
I would like to wait. Can you hear me loud and clear? Okay. Just making sure. I would like to add to what Daniel said about the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. I discussed this with my breakout room, and they're both important movements, and they have like similarities, differences between them. The goal of the civil rights movement was an effort to, of course, break down racial barriers and distinctions in the U.S. society, and to remove penalties and other negative consequences of the Black community. One thing I talked about with the civil rights movement was the fact that there were like a lot of like leaders, I guess you can say, like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. But when I was in high school, we didn't really talk about like the other leaders, if that makes sense. For example, I wasn't aware of this event took place on February 1, 1960, when 4 students decided, I believe, to sit in front of the lunch table or the coffee shop. And it's funny, like the fact that I only knew about the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., but it's like they just left it out. We didn't really talk about it, and we should really like talk about these guys because they're fighting for what they believe in. Yeah. Freedom. Yeah. Let's see. But continuing on, civil rights was an important achievement to increase liberalization in the U.S. system, and of course to show the eyes of the U.S. of like how it is. Let's see. But other than that, That's all I really have for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. So what I'm gonna want to kind of do is address Daniel and Brian, right? And I'm gonna work through Daniel first, and then kind of get to what Brian is talking about. And Daniel talks about, you know, Rosa Parks and her not wanting to give up her seat, right? In the section on the 80s, they talk about this idea of respectability politics. Somebody kind of give me a working definition of respectability politics. What is respectability politics?
Respectability politics. Well, I'm not sure what definition means, but what I think it means is like a respectable opinion, I guess. No.
Yeah. Right. So your politics, right, is going to be determined by whether this will be respected or not. Okay. So, for example, how this respectability politics played out in real time. So we use the example of Rosa Parks. Do y'all know that she wasn't the first person who refused to give up her seat on the bus?
No.
Right. Karen, you shaking your head? You're familiar with that?
Yeah, I am.
So do you know why Rosa Parks becomes the central figure and not the first person?
Not really. I just knew that she stood up for herself and she didn't let anybody tell her what to do. Like, she's like, no, I'm not getting off the bus. Like, I'm gonna sit right here.
Yeah.
You know, she defended herself and the Black community as well.
Absolutely. But the first person, and forgive me because I don't know her name, but the reason why she's not highlighted as Rosa Parks is highlighted is because she was a single mother, right? So she did not fit within the respectability politics, right? So she did what she did. Because of who she was, the civil rights movement came together and said, you know what, we're going to do this again, but this time we'll send out Rosa Parks because she fits within this idea of respectability politics, okay? She can't be devalued because of her status as a single mother. So this idea of respectability politics, right? And then Brian is saying, you know, like, I never heard about these other figures outside of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, right? Especially Martin Luther King. And I think really Martin Luther King gets done a great disservice because if you listen to how he's told based on America's interpretation of him, right, you would think that there's no radical essence to him at all, right? I encourage you all to listen to his last speech before he's assassinated. It's entitled, I've Been to the Mountaintop, right? And some of the themes of that speech is organizing workers, is the Poor People's Campaign, right? So towards the end, a very, very adamant stance against the war, right? So towards the latter end of Martin Luther King's career, he becomes much more radical, right? He starts to critique American money. And this is what gets him in trouble. And this is what ultimately gets him assassinated, right? But you don't hear about that version of Martin Luther King. All you hear is, I have a dream, okay? But again, because this fits very neatly within this idea of respectability politics. Let's think about how that plays out in our society today, right? What we can say is we're in the Black Lives Matter era, right? And when there's Black Lives Matter protests, the powers that be always respond with, well, that's not the way that you protest. King didn't do it that way. The civil rights struggle didn't do it that way, right? So again, they're limiting Black folks' capacity to advocate for their freedom within this idea of respectability politics. And King becomes the litmus test, if you will, for what's respectable and what's not respectable, right? We can look at Colin Kaepernick as one example, right? What is more nonviolent than simply taking a knee, right? But even still, they would critique what Colin Kaepernick was doing and use King to be the source of that critique. Like, King wouldn't want to do it that way. You're disrespecting the flag. Like, nah, King wouldn't have no problem with that because one, it's nonviolent, and two, he's advocating for the freedom and justice of our people, right? And this is what King's objective was. So this respectability politics becomes very dangerous when applied to people who are trying to advocate and jockey for their freedom, right? And this is why this term that Malcolm X is so famous for, by any means necessary, turns the idea of respectability politics on its head, right? Because it's not about what you deem acceptable. It's about me using whatever's in my access, whatever's in my grasp to get myself free, right? And all that's on the table, all that's permissible. Thank you, Marcus, Daniel, and Brian. That was a really well done fishbowl. With the last 15 minutes, I would like to hear from the rest of you all about what your thoughts were for the reading. One thing that we could do to kind of prompt our conversation, we've gone through some major epics in Black activist history, right? For example, Black Power era, Civil Rights era, right? Which one do you guys feel more inspired by, if you will, and which ones do you feel were the most effective?
I have a quick question. It's not pertaining to the question that you asked, but it was about earlier in the reading. I don't know if this was stated in the reading, but I believe it was Marcus Garvey. Didn't he advocate for racial solidarity, and he wanted Africans to migrate out of the U.S. and back into Africa?
Yes.
I just had a bit more questions. I'm wondering why he wanted that.
So there's a couple of ways to look at that. Good question, also, Kevin. From a political standpoint, right? When you talk about revolution, this is something that Malcolm X also says. You cannot have a question of revolution without questioning the aspect of land, right? And if you are to think about African people's history, our landmass is the continent of Africa, right? Not to mention the idea that Africa is the richest continent on the planet with the poorest people. I'm gonna say that one more time to make sure y'all caught that. Africa is the richest continent on the planet with the poorest people. What does that mean?
Do you mean the resources are rich? Like the land itself?
Yep. Everybody on here is either using a computer or a phone to access this Zoom, right? You cannot have a computer or a phone without Africa. There's a mineral in the Congo, I believe it's either called cobalt or coltan, I get the two confused. But that mineral is a prerequisite to any of these electronic devices, right? Not to mention the oil, the gold, the diamonds, the ivory. I could go on and 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 on about the resources that the Western world usurps out of Africa for to maintain itself, right? So again, I think it was Nicole who said the resources. You're absolutely right. All of the world's resources come out of this continent of Africa, right? But through the process of colonialism, Europeans have effectively been able to maneuver, Europeans, Arabs, and Asians have been effectively able to maneuver themselves to control the resources, and the people who are from that land, who are indigenous to that land, have no access to benefit or profit from those resources, right? So this is what I mean when I say the poorest people with the richest landmass. Garvey was attentive to this, and Garvey said, yo, that's out of pocket, right? That's backwards. So one thing that we need to do as African people is return to our homeland. Take back the ownership of our resources, right? And again, to Kevin, to your point, right? You can take it back to the flag. That green is about the land. And that land is Africa, right? I spent about 5 to 7 years in an organization called the All African People's Revolutionary Party. This organization was founded by Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of independent Ghana, Sekou Touré, who was the president of Guinea, and Kwame Touré, right, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. One of the things that they say in this organization is that this land, the Americas, is the appropriate land of the indigenous people of this country, right? So when I speak to indigenous, when I'm speaking about indigenous people, I'm talking about Joanna, I'm talking about Daniel, I'm talking about Brianna, I'm talking about Gabriel, right? I'm talking about Jessica, the indigenous people who you may call Native Americans, right? But I'm the people who originally belong to this land, right? So as African people, if we recognize that this land is theirs, then my appropriate homeland is where? In Africa, right? So these are some of the ideologies and theories that support Garvey's idea and notion of this idea of repatriation, right? Returning back to the land from which you came. And a part of that, Kevin, is the understanding that we're not going to return back to a pre-colonial Africa, because pre-colonial Africa is gone. That's not a reality anymore, right? But we're going to return to the Africa that is and do the work necessary to make it better, right? And not thinking about Africa as this utopian space where everything is perfect, right? Recognizing that there's work that needs to be done and carrying the fight to your homeland, right? It's like playing a game on and having home field advantage, right? Like you want to kind of defend your home turf. And that's kind of some of the ideas that surround this notion of repatriation. Good question. Who else? Thoughts about the reading or anything that was discussed today?
I have a question. This is Nicole. What I don't know if it elaborated in the reading or not, but what was the fizzle out, if you will, of the civil rights movement? Why did it die out? And I mean, obviously, Black Power movement took over.
Yeah, I think that's really where it's situalized at, Nicole, is we got really impatient with this idea of nonviolence, right? You can only get your ass whooped for so long and not fight back and continue to take that and think that it works. So, and another thing with that, right, is the youth movement. If you go back and read what it says about SNCC, like read that carefully, and that'll kind of give you the idea of why that civil rights movement fizzled out and Black Power took more steam, because the youth within that movement was like, yo, this ain't getting us nowhere. And then to think about also the assassinations that took place under civil rights, right? Malcolm X killed during the nonviolent era. Martin Luther King, the proponent of nonviolence, is murdered during the nonviolent era. So you can only like witness these type of things for so long and then not come to the natural conclusion of we got to fight back, right? So I think it was also just a natural evolution of the progression for liberation. Any other questions? Yeah, good question though. Any other questions? Thoughts, comments, concerns? Baba Pierre, we'll go to you, sir, for the last word and to see if it's okay for us to close out the day.
What I want to know, at the mid-60s, the civil rights movement ended. I don't know why Martin Luther King is killed after the movement he led had ended.
I think the best way to kind of address that question, Baba Pierre, one, Martin Luther King ideology, his political ideology evolved. And again, to kind of tie it back to Nicole's question, the youth was very instrumental in the evolution of Martin Luther King's political ideology, right? And one of the major catalysts of this evolution was the anti-war movement, right? Because King was really reluctant to take an anti-war stance. And the book that the autobiography that I mentioned, Ready for Revolution, dives really deep into this. And it was a really deep ideological struggle for the people of SNCC to convince Dr. King that this notion of anti-war position was something that he needed to take a hold of. And the argument of SNCC was essentially, how could you claim to be nonviolent but then support a war, right? And that was a contradiction that King could not wrestle with. He couldn't find peace in that contradiction, so he had to take up this stance of nonviolence. I'm sorry, of anti-war stance to be in alignment with his nonviolence, right? So those are one of the things that kind of causes him to be more radical than he was quite comfortable becoming, right? And then as this picks up, he begins to kind of focus again on the poor people's rights, right? And one thing about power in this country, once you start attacking that money, you're going to have problems, right? And again, I'll point you all back to his final speech before he was assassinated. I've been to the mountaintop, where he's calling for the organization of the sanitation workers in Tennessee to be mobilized and to be organized, right? Again, is getting at the money. He's calling for boycotts of companies like Coca-Cola because of their racist practices. So he's really starting in his lighter years to be an agitator for economic boycotts and things of that nature. And the state and the powers that be really don't want to deal with that. Also, Baba Pierre, if you look towards the end of the reading, when they talk about the post-civil rights era, the post-60s moment, the advent of COINTELPRO and personalities like J. Edgar Hoover, right? And this idea of eliminating the rise of a black messiah. And at the time where where Malcolm X has already been assassinated, there's no one who sits on this pedestal as the black messiah more than Dr. King, right? So if the goal of COINTELPRO is to eliminate the production and the development of a black messiah, then King has to go, right? So these are some of the things that led to his assassination. And ultimately, he wasn't going to be a political figure that could be controlled and manipulated by the powers that be. So he had to be eliminated.
Yes. The last concern is why Du Bois has chosen to pass his last days and die in Ghana, in Africa.
Yes. Good question, Bob Pierre. So to me, I situate Du Bois as one of our central intellectual figures, right? And I believe Du Bois, like all of our great intellectual giants from the African diaspora, he's baptized in Pan-Africanism, right? And if you watch Du Bois, you can literally see his intellectual development over the years, right? He lives a long time. Starting off, as I mentioned, with this idea of the talented 10th, we're only going to educate 10% of our population, and then they'll be tasked to educate the rest of the population, right? This is a very elitist conceptualization of how to achieve freedom, right? He goes through these things, he evolves. Du Bois is also the organizer of the first Pan-African Congress, right? They mention in the text the Niagara movement. This is also something that's from Du Bois. So Du Bois also, you cannot forget about Du Bois, first black man to receive his Ph.D. from Harvard, but also he goes to the Frankfurt School in Germany and is a trained sociologist. So he has an international perspective, right? So quite literally, Du Bois's classmates were Marx, Max Weber, right? All of these central figures in the canon of sociology was Du Bois's classmates. So there's a very keen understanding of international politics, right? And as this understanding of international politics develops, he starts to organize with the Communist Party. His organization through the Communist Party gets his passport revoked. So since he cannot return back to the United States, he's kind of traveling to all of these communist countries. And then the great Asajifo and Kwame Nkrumah invites him to come and live in Africa, in Accra, and he gives him the task of developing the encyclopedia in Afrikaner, right, which is some of Du Bois's last work, some of his dying work, is to produce this very in-depth, this very comprehensive encyclopedia on African experiences. And while he's doing this work, he makes this transition into the realm of the ancestors there in Accra, Ghana. So if that's my long-winded answer to Baba Pierre's question.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, sir. Are we good to end the class, Baba?
Thank you, Professor. Appreciate the class today.
You're welcome. So you guys have your readings attached to the modules on Canvas. I think the date might be off, so just look at the week. So even if it says the week 5, and I believe it says the 18th on the date, disregard the date. You know that we're in week 5, and try to get that assignment in as soon as possible. If anything else comes up, please let me know, and I'll be happy to address. Again, for extra credit, next Monday at 4 p.m., there will be a Zoom conversation on Afrofuturism. I will post the details to your Canvas. Also, there's a whole host of Black History Month events going on through Cerritos College. I believe there should be an email sent out with all those programs. All of those are extra credit available for you also. Other than that, you all, another beautiful day look like. So please go out and get some sun, get that vitamin D, get some exercise, get some water, be healthy, be wealthy, be wise, and I will see you all next Monday. Have a good one, Brian. Thank you, man.
Bye.
All right. Have a good one, y'all.